They called me Ray Maddox. That was my mother's name before she married, and I'd been using it for 18 years without anyone on those upper floors thinking twice. Night shift press technician, Caldwell Media Group, tower on 5th and Larimer, Millhaven, Ohio. I ran the Goss presses in the basement from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and I was good at it. Steady hands, quiet habits, and the kind of patience you develop when you have raised a 13-year-old daughter alone and learned that most things worth doing are done slowly and without applause. The work suited me. There is an honesty to a printing press. It does exactly what the settings demand, no more, no less. And it tells you immediately when something is wrong. You can feel a calibration drift in your palms before you can see it on the page. I had spent 8 years learning those machines the way I had once spent 14 months learning a corruption case, by staying close, paying attention, and trusting what my hands were telling me. Clara used to ask me why I worked nights. I told her I liked the quiet. That was true, as far as it went. What I did not tell her was that I had stood in a newsroom once, under different lighting, and a different name, and that the woman who owned the building above my presses had made it her particular business to see that I never stood in one again. I had been Raymond Maddox Thorne then, 18 years ago. That name had appeared above the fold on the front page of a paper, 3 times the size of this one, attached to a story that put United States Senator Gerald Foss in a federal courtroom and eventually a federal prison. Bribery, obstruction, the deliberate manipulation of a state infrastructure contract that cost 11 workers their pensions and cost 2 of them their lives when the bridge they'd been cheated out of maintaining gave way on a Tuesday morning in March. I had worked that story for 14 months. I had a source inside Foss's office, a procurement auditor named Dennis Price who had watched it happen and kept meticulous records in a plain green ledger. The story ran: Foss was indicted within the week. What happened next took a little longer. Vera Caldwell had been a rising publisher in those days, ambitious and precise. She was also, I would later learn, a close personal friend of Senator Foss and the primary beneficiary of 3 of the same infrastructure advertising contracts that my story unraveled. She did not come at me directly. She was too careful for that. What she did was plant a question, a single, well-timed question in a competing outlet, about my source. Not an accusation, just a question. Had I protected my source adequately? Had Dennis Price been compromised before or after speaking to me? The question had no answer, because there was no evidence for it. But in the industry we worked in, a question asked loudly enough becomes its own kind of answer. Within 6 months my editor had moved on. My next contract had been quietly declined, and 2 other papers that had expressed interest in my work had stopped returning calls. Vera Caldwell had not fired me. She had simply made me disappear. My wife, Joanna, was still alive then. She was the one who found the press technician certification program. She said, "Learn the machines, keep your hands busy, and wait. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone asked a question about it." She died of a cardiac event 4 years after that, when Clara was 9, and she never knew whether she was right. I thought she was. I had waited 18 years to find out. The night it started was a Thursday in October. I was running the late proof cycle on the morning edition when the story flagged on my station. It was a feature on regional digital advertising revenues, dry material, nothing that would move anyone. But there was a source citation in paragraph 11 that had been entered twice with slightly different attribution codes. A small thing. The kind of thing that gets missed at every level above the press room because the editors are thinking about headlines and placement, not database entries. I pulled up the source file, cross-referenced the intake log, and sent a note upstairs to the night editor, a young man named Garrett, who had never once come down to see the presses in the 8 months he'd held the job. He replied in 4 minutes, "Thank you for the note. Not relevant to publication. Please continue your run." I noted the discrepancy in my shift log, as I always did, and continued the run. 3 weeks later, a packet arrived through the press room's physical intake channel, an old brass slot in the exterior wall at the base of the building, left over from the days when freelance photographers dropped film at odd hours. Nobody used it anymore. Most people in the building didn't know it existed. I knew it existed because I had used it myself, a long time ago, when I needed to get material to a press room without going through a lobby. The packet was sealed. addressed to the Caldwell Media editorial team. No return information. Inside were 43 pages of internal communications and billing records from Caldwell Media's digital advertising subsidiary, documenting a pattern of fraudulent impression reporting that had been running for at least 3 years. The numbers were specific and sourced. They were also, I noticed immediately, consistent with the double-attributed source entry I had flagged 3 weeks earlier in paragraph 11 of that Dry Thursday feature. That entry had been dismissed in 4 minutes. The packet it predicted had taken 3 weeks to arrive. Whoever had assembled this had been careful and patient. I recognized the architecture of the thing, the way the evidence had been layered, each document referencing the next, building toward a conclusion that could not be argued with. Good investigative work looks a certain way. You know it when you've done it yourself. I logged the packet in the intake record, sealed it in the archive sleeve, and sent it upstairs through the internal mail system at 5:47 in the morning. By 8 o'clock I was home, making Clara's breakfast before she left for school. She was reading a library book at the kitchen table, her hair still damp, a piece of toast going cold beside her. She looked up when I came in. "You look like you're thinking," she said. "I usually am," I told her. "You look like you're thinking about something specific." I poured a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. She had Joanna's eyes, the same quality of attention, the feeling that she was reading a sentence you hadn't finished writing yet. "Something came in tonight," I said. "At the press room. Something good. I thought about that." "Something true," I said. "Whether it's good depends on what they do with it." She went back to her book. I drank my coffee and did not sleep well. What happened upstairs moved quickly. Vera Caldwell had the packet on her desk by 9. By noon, the managing editor had been called in. By 2 o'clock, the digital advertising subsidiary's general counsel was in the building. I know this because Clara's school was closed for a teacher workday, and she had come in with me that evening, as she sometimes did, sitting at the break room table doing homework while I ran calibrations. She was the one who told me the elevator had been busy all afternoon, with people in suits she didn't recognize. "Somebody's in trouble," she said, not looking up from her notebook. "Probably," I said. Vera Caldwell's response to the packet was not to run the story. Her response was to order a full review of every employee who had handled materials in the building in the preceding 30 days. An internal audit, the memo said. Routine. I read the memo on the break room board and went back to my station. The legal team arrived on a Monday. They were deposing anyone who had logged contact with press room intake materials. The list was short. Most incoming material came through digital systems now, and my name was on it, because I had logged the packet and I had logged it correctly. I was the last interview of the day. The attorney was a careful, even-tempered man named Harlan Cole, who had the look of someone accustomed to rooms where the stakes were high and the voices were low. He asked me to walk him through the intake log entry. I did. He asked whether I had read the contents of the packet before logging it. I told him I had reviewed it sufficiently to confirm it was editorial material rather than a mechanical delivery. He wrote something down. Then he asked me to confirm the name I had worked under here. I gave him Ray Maddox. He nodded and wrote that down too. Then he said, in the same even voice, that during their archive review, they had found an 18-year-old intake document from this building's predecessor paper, the Millhaven Courier, which Caldwell Media had acquired in 2014. The document was a sourcing affidavit, filed in connection with an investigative series published in 2008. The name on the affidavit was Raymond Maddox Thorne. He looked at me across the table and waited. I said, "Yes, that's me." The room got very quiet. Not the quiet of the press room at 3 in the morning, which is a working quiet, a quiet with purpose. This was the quiet of something shifting that cannot be shifted back. Harlan Cole excused himself. I sat at the table and looked at my hands. There was ink along the edge of my right thumb, the way there always was by the end of a shift. A thin dark line that soap didn't fully reach, the mark of the presses. Joanna used to say it looked like a tattoo. I used to say it was, in a way. Vera Caldwell came in 17 minutes later. I had not seen her up close before. She was a composed woman, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where she controlled what happened next. She looked at me, and I could see the calculation working behind her eyes, running the numbers, checking the exits, finding the angle. It was an expression I recognized, I had written about people who made that expression. I had learned what it meant. She said, "I had no idea you were here." I said, "I know." She said, "How long?" I said, 8 years. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "The packet." I said, "I logged it. Intake, archive, internal mail. Everything in the record." She understood what I was telling her. The packet was in the system. The source was protected, as a source always should be, and I had not touched that protection. I had simply made sure the material existed in every log it was supposed to exist in, handled correctly, by the book, at every step. What she had intended to bury had been documented 18 times over by the man she had once tried to make disappear, in the building she owned, on equipment I had been running for 8 years. I pushed the original intake sleeve across the table. Her own archive label was on it, in her company's own format. I said, "The story is already told, Ms. Caldwell. The only question is, who tells it to the public?" She looked at the sleeve. She looked at my hands. She looked at my face. I held her gaze the way I had learned to hold it, steadily, without heat, because the work had never been about heat. It had always been about patience, and the belief that the truth has weight, and that weight, over time, goes somewhere. It finds a table. It finds a room. It finds the right set of hands. She said, very quietly, "You could have come to me." I said, "I tried that once." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up the sleeve and set it back in front of me. She said, "Publish it." I drove home in the gray October morning, the sun just catching the tops of the buildings on Larimer. Clara was already at the table when I came in, homework from the night before, a cold glass of orange juice, her library book open beside her. She looked up. "You're smiling," she said. "Am I?" "A little. Just around the eyes." She studied me. "Did something happen?" I poured my coffee and sat down. Outside, the first of the delivery trucks was pulling away from the loading dock, carrying the morning edition up 5th Street and out across the city. My presses, my hands, my ink, still there along the edge of my thumb. I said, "Your mother used to tell me that the truth doesn't disappear just because someone asks a question about it." Clara waited. "She was right," I said. She looked at me for another moment, then nodded once, as if she had always known it would come to this, and went back to her book. I drank my coffee while the city woke up around us, and for the first time in 18 years, I felt the exact weight of everything, exactly where it belonged.